Hello and welcome to another episode of Cavell Cloud Conversations. I'm Finbarr, that's Patrick, your hosts, analyst at the Cavell Group, or just Cavell these days, I guess. Here to talk to you about the latest in cloud. This week's homework, well, we're talking about the future of the phone number in the UCaaS world, and I set Patrick some homework before this episode. He wasn't allowed to look it up, but I just asked him to think where or what was the cause. And I guess there's kind of two causes of the origins of the phone number in the telephone system. Patrick, what have you come up with?
So just to peek behind the fourth wall here, we discussed the planning of this yesterday, and I promised Finbar I wouldn't Google this, but I thought in the background I will Google it just so I don't seem like. But I completely forgot, Finbar. So I have.
Oh, okay. So you planned to cheat, but then you didn't cheat. I like it.
Yeah, I planned to cheat, but then my own incompetence and busyness has caused me not to cheat. So origins of the phone number. Now I know this isn't right because it was my preliminary guess yesterday. I thought it must be. Maybe something to do with area code, but let me just clarify that. I remember something to do with sports commentary, that there was back to square one, the saying comes from visualizing stuff on the radio, so you'd have like one area of the pitch would be square. Is it something to do with area codes or location related?
No. So
okay, fair.
The technical original origin, because when the phone was invented, people started messing around with phone numbers reasonably quickly, mostly, as you would expect, to deal with issues of scalability, right? So the original phones were operated by a switchboard operator. You would say the name or the address of the person you wanted to speak to. They would either know, if the good ones would know which port that was, and the other ones would go and consult a book and find the number, right, of the house and which switch to put it into. So certain cities and places were starting to think maybe we need a better system. But really what happened is in 1879, there was a town in Massachusetts called Lowell where there was a massive measles outbreak. And what do you think happened when the measles outbreak occurred, right? Adults get measles as well, remember?
All of the good operators
operators got immediately sick. And you would call up the switchboard, and the new person they brought in to manage it had no clue where Patrick Watson was on this board. So obviously the person who was organising it said, fine, we're going to give everyone a number. The ports are all going to be numbered, and whoever comes in will just have access to the book, and they can say, oh, give me number 5, and that will work. Fast forward on, quite a few years later, maybe 150, 250? 150, right? Let's not add an extra 100 years for no reason. And obviously telephone numbers are still the foundational basis of our communication system. But I thought it was interesting, if you look back at history, that the original telephones were a name request system. So I would call up the switchboard operator and say, get me Patrick Watson. And that person would get me Patrick Watson. And now, when I use Teams, I obviously just click Patrick Watson's name, and the system knows who Patrick Watson is. So I'll keep saying Patrick Watson, I like that. But my point is, right, Patrick, we're going to debate on this episode, quick fire debate. I think that phone numbers are obsolete. I think they open us up to a ton of fraud, which we'll talk about later. I am recently, and it's quite relevant, which is why it's on my mind, is that my phone number is currently being spoofed by a scammer, right? And every so often I get a call being like, why did you call me about this? And I'm like, no, someone's just made... And I talked to Vodafone about it. They said, we can't do anything. They'll move on to another number soon. And I'm like, what is going on here? So the phone number should go away. What are your thoughts?
This all sounds like a very elaborate pre-alibi for a potential crime that you're committing.
No. But let's just focus.
Okay,
what are your initial thoughts on the premise? Right, phone numbers are obsolete. We should go back to say who you want to speak to and just call them.
Okay, so my first argument, and I have done a little bit of prep on the arguments, although I hadn't done my revision of why phone numbers originated. The first thing I thought of, and not my area of forte, is purely numbers versus letters in terms of maths being a sort of and numbers being a universal constant. So you have multiple. I mean, obviously, numbers are different characters in different languages, but maths is universal across language. I think I'm correct. I'm looking for Finbarr for reassurance on this. Maths is not my absolute specialist subject.
In the majority of the countries in the world, the
Yeah.
Arabic numeral system has taken root. Yes.
Yes. So that's what I'm going for as first point.
Yeah.
Numbers more universal than either characters or language. as
Okay.
a as a as a as a
Yeah.
as a most universal theme. That's my first argument
So
for phone numbers.
here's a challenge to that. Then, do we? So we all get calls from people we don't really want to call us, right?
Yep.
Do we need a universal system, right? Do I need a publicly available, accessible phone number, or do I need a link that I provide to people, which allows them to call me? So you think about all the people I want to call me, the vet, the doctor, a company that I bought something from. I could share them a link that lets them call me. I don't need to, give them a number that could then be given to anyone. Is universality a good thing? That's a question.
Yeah, no, I suppose you're right. I suppose there's both there's pros and cons to that. I suppose there are. I can think of examples in my past, cold calling people where you're absolutely right. I didn't want them to know who's calling because I wanted them to answer to a generic number. And there's still a number of numbers that call me that I answer that I wish I never would have picked up because I didn't know who was actually on the end of the number. So no, that is a very fair point. But yeah, that was my first sort of stab at it. That and the my follow-up rationale, and again, this is probably easy to shoot down, was I thought about alternatives. So either your name and what I then thought of was email address. Now I don't know about you, Finbarr, and I'm not going to give it out on the podcast, but my personal email address, probably with most people of our age, millennial age, I set up when I was, I don't know, 11, and it is maybe not. I wouldn't say it's inappropriate, but it is not.
Oh, okay.
It's not the. It's not the. It doesn't
Manchester
necessarily.
Beefcakes 99 or something.
Not quite. But
Yeah.
it is both not massively appropriate and doesn't really make any sense. So it's almost like a random collection of English characters,
Yeah.
English letters.
And,
So
and
how's
also
that any better than the phone
arguably,
number?
like, as a public access system, there's not that much of a difference between an email address and a phone number, right? In terms of
Yeah.
giving away your random information, right? You're still opening yourself up to spam and people to call you. So, I mean, letters versus numbers is kind of interesting. But I think
I'm good. I'm glad that I've done all right there. I'm quite pleased with that as a first
I
point.
think the main thing is, right, so we have this system whereby anyone can call anyone, which arguably we don't want anymore.
Yeah.
And the only people who benefit from, well, I suppose if you think about it, I'm turning against myself now because I think it should go, but
Good, I like it.
arguably, the only people who really need it are the government and the emergency services and things like that. But they know where you are anyway, right?
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my second point, and again to take your tack of both going for and against myself, the phone number in the way that it's used now is both sort of direct and immediate. And we did some research at Cavell about generational communication preferences and etiquette towards communicating with someone. And the concept of calling someone, this is an old hat, is inherently rude. If I
Yeah.
at my convenience, Finbarr, I have your mobile number. I
Yeah.
dial your mobile number. I have no idea what you're doing. All the phone is doing is effectively saying, talk to me now, talk to me now, talk to me now, talk to me now, until you talk to me, regardless of what you're doing. It's only considerate on my end. So that is a negative in terms of sort of etiquette and polite. But to your point, in terms of the immediacy of if there is an imminent natural disaster. As you know, the US does much better on warning, mobile numbers in the US than we do in the UK. We're trialing the emergency alert system in a very different way.
But I don't think that's done with numbers anymore. I think it's done with a push notification system.
Is it push notification and not numbers?
You get a pop-up on your phone that says, "Hey,
that is true. That is true.
Something's coming." It's an emergency alerting system.
Maybe I should. Yeah, but
this is interesting, right?
That immediacy piece is still a
But if we're talking about like the government and the emergency services, right? I mean, you interact with your GP, you go to an app, you fill out some information, and you say, "Hey, talk to me about my problem," and they text you or they call you back, right? That's fine. They could do that through any number of systems. If the app was actually well designed, they could do it via that. The government could reach you in multiple ways with sort of like a push notification system or anything like that. Yeah. So, I mean, my contention is that the only people who actually call your phone number anymore that couldn't do it a different way are people that you don't want to speak to. And that's purely my contention. I think everyone else would have a way to contact you because you opt into the communication.
Yeah, well, okay. So let me take a slightly different tack. So to your example of a link, what happens if I don't have internet data access?
Well, get some. I mean, some of these systems work even without like data because it just gets pushed over the mobile network. But
yeah, no, and I fully appreciate that, and connectivity provision, and with the various satellite systems that I won't name any particular brands that are being pushed universally by megalomaniac,
which don't work because they can't handle the scale, and everyone started to use them.
Cabela's a politically neutral podcast, but so access to data generally and connectivity a lot better, but still the network coverage is better than universal data coverage in the majority. The majority of
no, that is definitely true. Let's move on now because we've been talking just kind of more esoterically and broadly about the phone number in a public context. But obviously that's not really the focus of this podcast. We are a business communications focused company. We use Teams. We use Zoom. We don't use Slack. We do sometimes WhatsApp. I mean, when we're at events and stuff like that. None of those systems, I would say, that we use to communicate daily require a phone number. And I think the same is true for a lot of businesses now. So why are phone numbers still a key part of a UCaaS platform?
Well, I think the ultimate truth to that is a legacy, and part of the thing we talked about in the last point in terms of the access and connectivity is just because, as you said, going back to 1879, we've been setting up these networks, fixed line and mobile and whatever various iterations that we could go for. So first of all, it is primarily legacy. I think there's a really interesting point in business communications to the point that you were talking about previously of actually, although if I, as you said, I might want if my bank has got something important they want to get in touch with me about, if they get in touch with me and I clearly know it's my bank through some sort of identification, then I'm perfectly happy with that. What we know at the moment is that businesses want a phone number for their own verification, even really small businesses. And we know this from our enterprise research. If you set up, if Patrick and I set up Patrick and Finbarr's kebab shop, it's a very small business. We're only really taking businesses orders, through Just Eat or Uber Eats or whatever. We don't necessarily need a phone number. Virtually every small business will get a phone number just so they have that credibility of a fixed line area code number, which gives that business a bit of referenceability. So I think going back to your original, it is legacy and also expectation that you will have a phone number.
Okay. Well, I'm big on not doing things just because they're legacy.
I agree.
We used to call it
right.
Yeah, we used to call it Future Finbarr. We talk about innovation, not just for the sake of innovation, but because it's the better way of doing things. So let's just talk about that point a minute. So people are getting phone numbers. People like having phone numbers as a point of contact or identity. But we've already mentioned like phone numbers can be spoofed to a large degree. Even business phone numbers can be. Is it a fair thing that my contention is that due to the level of fraud that is rising and the ability for AI to impersonate someone, this I could, based on modern technology, it could be my avatar on this podcast instead of me right now copying my voice if I had put the work in to set that up. And you would, you might be able to realize, but you might not. The phone number isn't good enough, is my contention, as a form of fraud prevention and identification. And I guess the point then is, if I'm saying to a company, a phone number isn't good enough, you need to give me something more, why would that complexity still be tied to the phone number? Why wouldn't it just be tied to me as a person, right? Finbarr at Cavell.
Yeah, no, I think that's that is a really valid argument. You're right. We did, and I was more answering the question of sort of why we're in the current sort of situation that we are. But you're right. So
Yeah.
we did a let's look at some data. So we did a survey at Cavell. We work very closely on behalf of the Cloud Communications Alliance, and we did a survey of their members, and they are obviously service providers and telcos who are very concerned with fraud, and the vast majority of them cited that between 1 and 25% of their customer calls are either fraudulent, potentially fraudulent, or being mislabeled as possible spam. So you're absolutely right. We have this huge problem with number spoofing and increasingly complex fraudulent usage of phone numbers. So you're absolutely right. If there is an alternative, and there are alternatives out there that I'm sure we'll touch on, if not today in future pods. It is a real problem for the industry. The other point that I just wanted to touch on briefly in data, and this sort of counters my point. The argument that you made, for example, so we use Teams or Zoom or WebEx that don't require a phone number. In all of the developed markets that Cavell cover, so if we take the US as an example, so the business telephony market of 80 million users or whatever that is declining every year. The number of users with a DDI associated to them is declining because every year, as those legacy users migrate to cloud-based, generally collaboration-based systems like WebEx or Zoom or whatever it might be, or actually a certain proportion, not everybody needs a DDI because you're not going to make external calls. They're making exactly that argument that you made previously, Finbarr, that they're just identifying with their name or whatever that might be. So you're absolutely right. I think there's two things. The fraud situation is current in the industry. The industry is working to try and rectify that, but it's still a problem. And ultimately, we are seeing the number of phone numbers, both commercial, but definitely from a business sense, decline. Partly because of some of those issues around that, and just the non-requirement for external PSTN-based telephony.
That is interesting, though, because we also talk quite a lot about the enablement market, which is entirely about bringing that connectivity into the system as well.
Yeah, bringing PSTN voice.
That must be a growing market too. I mean, there is a link in dependency at the moment still between UCaaS and PSTN that isn't going to go away?
Yeah, definitely. But and then I suppose the controversial question there would be, is that because we are going back to that legacy point, we are desperately clinging on to try and maximize this legacy infrastructure that we've invested in?
Yeah,
that would be the controversial point there. Maybe,
but that would be the point that I would make, is that all of these companies have built a PSTN infrastructure. It does work.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily what we need in the future. And are they just keeping it because they have it and they're comfortable with it and they know how to build it and they are voice engineers and they're PSTN engineers? Is it on its way out? Should it leave? I guess is a bigger question.
Yeah, well, I think the should it leave is a separate. But going back to that decline, we, as I said, at Cavell, in all of the developed markets that we cover, the fixed line business telephony, the number of people with a fixed line business telephony number is declining significantly in all of those developed markets. If you look at the US, if you look at the UK, if you look at Western European markets, even if you look at advanced markets in APAC, the number of people with a DDI is definitely on the decline.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I get it. Should it leave is a very philosophical question about the future of the industry.
Well, yeah, I mean, partially the reason I deliberately sat on the fence incredibly hard then and didn't answer that is because, first of all, I think partly because of the legacy stuff that we talked about previously. Not only are the providers of all of this familiar with it, but so are end user businesses and so are consumers.
Yes.
And in that research, a lot of the research that you've done in customer service, we've done loads of research of consumers. When you get a really serious problem, you want to ring a number. You want to ring 911. You want to ring 999. You want something to call. You want something immediate, direct. So until we come up with, there are alternatives out there, an alternative. But the problem is, how do you educate sort of universally the world about the better alternative, and how do you get that provision of access? That is, it's like the analogy I would use, and maybe we've gone absolutely wild off topic here. Is the road network and automobile transport. If I suggested that to you now as an idea, that we're going to set up this huge road infrastructure network as a new idea, you'd say, Patrick, that's a ridiculous undertaking.
I'd be like, build some train stations, build better buses.
But because it's there,
bicycle rental.
We've got to leverage it, and we're desperately trying to use nitrogen or electric cars, and it's the same, I think, in telephony networks as well. Potentially, we've got these huge networks there. We've got this vast, exposure and experience and knowledge of them, both in the providers themselves, but also individuals globally who know how to use phones. Maybe there is no way that we can move away from that, considering where we are now.
And this, because I don't want people just to think I'm beating up on Patrick and making him ask questions about whether or not the UCaaS industry is flawed and all these kind of things. Because I think I want people to believe that I have some narrative control over where this podcast goes. But we are kind of coming full circle to where I thought this debate would go when we started it, which was we could get rid of it tomorrow, right? There are lots of companies, the Zooms and the Teams, and even other companies like Salesforce who are building internal agents and handling communications that way rather than using, UC channels. We could get rid of it, but as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's getting rid of it is the thing that makes the most sense. It doesn't necessarily mean, that we should innovate just for the sake of innovation. Because if you think about solving specific problems that we raised at the start, fraudulent calls from spam numbers, we can fix there are solutions to fix that problem. Better identification and verification while keeping the phone number. There is a solution to fix that problem. So I guess I like to create the black and white because that's entertaining and interesting. And you're adding in like the color all over the place,
No, I think it's a really interesting debate to have, and as we said, I think definitely the business telephony markets are on the decline. It's how far it goes, and can we ever truly go back from what we have sort of set up as an infrastructure, or will it just be a gradual evolution of that communication, and we'll still leverage some of that network to a point, but there will be a gradual decline. I think that's probably what's most likely to happen, that we will, providers will want to utilize these assets. They still play a beneficial role to a lot of individuals, both in terms of mobile networks, but also fixed line. But in the long run, that is probably going to decline in a traditional sense and evolve into communications in another way. And then the phone number, to your point, Finbarr, it's much easier for me to remember your name than it is 077938 plus 4407, which also is not Finbarr's number.
I was going to say, can you? Thankfully, you're miles away. Thankfully,
yeah. But, I still remember various of my, and this is a final
childhood home, grandfather's
I still remember
house.
my friends' numbers, their local area codes, and their numbers that would ingrained into. And this really ages me, because anyone listening to this who's not a millennial will be, why on earth would you have to memorize these people's numbers? It's because they weren't, on the phone. So this is rather
No,
old
because
man
when you
shouts
wanted to
at
pick up
cloud.
your house phone and
Yeah, of
call
course. Yeah.
somebody, or you went to a random payphone because you were lost away from
Yeah.
home, you had to know who you were calling, and you had to
Yeah.
be able to call your parents and be like, "Mum, I went walking and I'm in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah. Come and get
and
me.
come and get me." There's a and you'd have to tell her to guess where you were. You'd be like, "There's a neon sign. I think there's a Tesco.
Yeah. There was
I
no
think
what. There was no
the
what three
street
words
corner
there.
says,
Sharing
Shaftesbury
your
Avenue."
location. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
there you go. So this is kind of a bit longer than we normally do, but I thought it was a really interesting discussion.
Yes.
Should phone numbers die in the UCaaS space? I think the conclusion of our debate is they are on the decline, but there are use cases that they're still good for. There is obviously a whole familiarity side of it. There's a whole, we have this ecosystem and it does work, and we're not just going to replace it just because the shiny new thing has come along. But it is something that is on the potential chopping block, and you can see a lot of new systems being built that are being built with a phone number as their primary means of identification. And there are downsides to the system that we have in terms of fraud, in terms
Completely,
of spam calling, and all these other kind of things. But it is still a beneficial system in many ways. Any last thoughts, Patrick?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. The only thing I would request from listeners is so this is a slightly new format that we thought we would do in terms of a sort of more interactive debate. Is what almost undefendable communications arguments can we give Finbarr to defend in future? And what we'll also do is, although Finbarr did give me prep time, which I wasted, we'll give him absolutely no prep time and just some sort of undefendable argument on the back end. But no, I really enjoy it, and I think it's and we'd love to hear people's opinions on this as well, in terms of where they think the market's going, and what the best alternatives would be, and what we do about number spoofing and all of those things, because a lot of the stuff that's been implemented hasn't necessarily worked. So we'd love
If
to
you
listen.
are a firm and stalwart defender of the phone number and you think it should never go, then you should find a way to message us and let us know, because we'll be interested to hear from you. We think you are probably
Or
a rare
dial.
breed. You can't you can't call me. I will not give you my phone number. But you probably can find my email address out there somewhere, or find me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, it's been great to chat. Thank you all for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks. I'll say we'll be back in 2 weeks. We like to do these fairly regularly. With the next Cavell Cloud Conversations topic to be decided. But I have, as Patrick said, we are trying out some new formats. So if you like the debate, let us know. And I will give Patrick the easy side next time, and I'll be the one. He'll be the one asking the hard questions. Speak to you all soon.
Bye, everybody. So,